بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبعه هداه أما بعد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Welcome to this session of Maxims of Fiqh. Today inshallah we will talk about the evolution of Maxims of Fiqh. Maxims of Fiqh as a separate science was not formulated at once. It took lots of years to evolve. And as we said earlier that many of the maxims were from the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But other maxims, they were formulated later. And we look at the books of scholars and we find the first mentioning of a maxim would be in the book of Imam Abu Yusuf rahimahullah, the student of Abu Hanifa. His book Al-Kharaj, here where we find the oldest maxim. And for instance, the example of the maxims that he mentioned is At-Ta'zir ala Qadr al-Jarima. The unspecific punishment is estimated by the Imam based on the magnitude of the crime. That's an example for the maxim of fiqh. Or in another example where he mentioned also in the book, كل من مات وليس له وارث فماله لبيت المال. Everyone who dies, who passes away, and he has no heir, then where does his money go? He says his money goes to Baytul Mal. These are some examples of the maxims that Imam Abu Yusuf rahimahullah mentioned. Also we find Muhammad ibn al-Hasan, the other student of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah, he also mentioned some of the maxims in his book on the fashion of the maxims that we see in our books nowadays. Later on, we see Imam al-Shafi'i rahimahullah in his book Al-Umm, in the fiqh of the school of thought of Imam al-Shafi'i, we see some of the maxims mentioned there as well. One of the examples is that الرخص لا يتعدى بها موضعها. The concessions are not to be extended to other cases. They are limited. Also Imam Ahmad rahimahullah had some maxims, and one of the examples that he mentioned is that everything you can give as a gift is you can sell. That's another example of the maxims that are mentioned by Imam Ahmad. So you see scholars are mentioning some of the maxims but not a separate science or a separate book dedicated only for the maxims of fiqh. That was the first phase where we find one or two or few maxims are mentioned in a book. Then the second phase is where we find some scholars mentioning maxims together, separately. And the first one to mention maxims together, separately, is Imam Abu Tahir al-Dabbusi rahimahullah, who mentioned 17 maxims. He is a scholar from the Hanafi school of thought. But then we find another Imam who is contemporary to al-Dabbusi, who died in the year 340, Imam Abu al-Hasan al-Karkhi. He mentioned 39 maxims and he used to repeat them. Imam Al-Karkhi, he used to repeat these maxims, and as you see, that was the age of taqlid. That was the age of copying or following one school of thought. And that was the second phase where we have maxims are formulated separately in one book. Now after these writings, we don't find unique writings until we reach the 6th century, where we find other books, large books that are written as maxims. One of the famous writings is the writing of Imam Al-Izz ibn Abd al-Salam rahimahullah, who died in the year 660. He wrote a book called Qawa'id al-Ahkam wa Masalih al-Anam. The Qawa'id, the maxims of the rulings and the benefits of the humans. Also, Imam Abu Bakr al-Fasi, he had a book about the maxims. He is from the Maliki school of thought. Now, still, we have some books of maxims, but the science of maxims itself did not reach its peak. The golden age of the maxims of fiqh is the 8th century. In the 8th century, we find many scholars writing many books in the maxims of fiqh. One of them is Imam Ibn al-Wakil in his book Al-Ashbah wa Nadha'ir. One of them is Imam al-Maqqari, Qawa'id al-Maqqari. He is from the Maliki school of thought. One of them is Al-Zarkashi, the Shafi'i scholar, in his book Al-Manthur. Manthur is like the dispersed. That was the golden age where we find many books of maxims of fiqh. Then scholars continued until the science, this type of knowledge, reached its tipping point in the 10th century. And by then we find many books of maxims of fiqh. The same book, Ashbah wa Nadha'ir, for Ibn Nujaym, this time the same name but for a different scholar, Imam Ibn Nujaym al-Hanafi, and Al-Ashbah wa Nadha'ir for Imam al-Suyuti, who died in the year 911. That was the age where it reached the tipping point for the maxims of fiqh. From these writings of the scholars, from the beginning with Imam al-Dabbusi until the 10th century, within all these years, the books that wrote the maxims, they are either books of fiqh, they included one chapter for maxims, or they are books of separate issues that they considered maxims, but they are not maxims, or they are books indeed of maxims of fiqh. And one of the famous books that we will talk about is the book of Imam al-Suyuti rahimahullah, Al-Ashbah wa Nadha'ir. For instance, this is an example. This is the book Al-Ashbah wa Nadha'ir for Imam al-Suyuti rahimahullah. Now, this book is divided to 7 chapters. In the first chapter, he mentioned the grand maxims. We earlier said that the grand maxims are 6, but many scholars consider them only 5. They omitted the last one, أعمال الكلام أولى من إهماله. Imam al-Suyuti rahimahullah, he has an amazing thing when he mentions all the maxims of fiqh, and then he says the entire religion goes back to 2 words only. It's summarized in 2 words, الضرر يزال. The harm is to be removed. That is the purpose of all the rulings in Islam, to protect the personnel and to protect the properties. It is الضرر يزال. So the first chapter, he mentioned the grand maxims. Then the second chapter, he included the major maxims, and he mentioned then 40 of the maxims. And then after that, he mentioned smaller maxims that are not general, but still they are agreed upon by scholars. And he mentioned then 20 maxims. So we have the 5 grand maxims, then the second chapter we have 40 maxims, and then we have 20 agreed upon maxims. Then after that, he had a chapter where he said it's unfit for the jurist not to know these rulings. باب ما يقبح بالعالم جهله ما ينبغي على كل عالم علمه. That's the chapter where he mentioned the maxims that every jurist should know, of the maxims and of the rulings. So in brief, the total maxims that Imam Suyuti rahimahullah mentioned in this book is 130 maxims. Some scholars, they also wrote the book on the fashion of maxims, like Qawaid ibn Rajab rahimahullah, but they were not really formulated in the way of maxims. It's just like a book of fiqh, but he wrote one line as a maxim, then another line as a maxim. Then we have scholars who composed poems, poetry as maxims, and these are the most famous writings in the maxims of fiqh. هذا وصلى الله وسلم على محمد وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.